Great. Hello and welcome everyone. Let's take a couple of seconds to welcome our attendants. Welcome to the final webinar of Kvinna and Oxfam co-organized webinar series, The Road to COP27 Advancing Gender Equality Through Climate Action, where we will invite experts from around the globe to explore opportunities, setting the advocacy agenda, and how we can leverage climate change action and finance for gender equality. As the title suggests, this webinar will host 5 remarkable speakers from the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Oxfam, Arab Watch Coalition, and the main region, and that we will invite our speakers to share their knowledge, experience on how we can collaborate and work collectively against climate change, and how to leverage climate change action and finance for gender equality. This webinar will also introduce how to build a climate movement as youth in the MENA region, and how to get involved in the climate justice movements as a youth in the MENA region. My name is Samah Ilos, and I'm thrilled to be your guide for this fabulous set of speakers and this conversation we're going to have today, where our speakers are going to speak in English and Arabic, and we're going to have simultaneous interpretation from English to Arabic and vice versa will be provided during the webinar. And just click on the below option to activate the interpretation. ضيوفنا اليوم رح يتحدثوا بعضهم باللغة الإنجليزية وبعضهم باللغة العربية. لدينا ترجمة متزامنة يمكنكم تفعيلها من طريق النقر على أيقونة الكرة الأرضية الموجودة بأسفل الشاشة. As a note, today's event is being recorded, and once we finish from the series, the whole series will be uploaded on Kvinna YouTube channel. So let's get started, and we are starting with the perfect guide to kick off this conversation. Our first speaker is Layan Shalatik, and she's going to speak in English. Layan is the Associated Director of the Washington office of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, a German political party foundation affiliated with the German Green Party with 33 offices worldwide working on sustainable development, human rights, and gender democracy. At the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Layan spearheads the foundation's work on international climate finance with an emphasis on the transparency and accountability of public climate finance flows, human rights-centered and gender transformative access to climate funding, including via the Green Climate Fund, where she represents civil society concerns to the board as a CSO active observer for development countries from 2016 to 2019, and other climate funds. She has more than 20 years of experience in global governance issues, specifically in international development and finance and international climate negotiations, where a particular interest of her work revolved around engendering macroeconomic and finance policy. She holds dual master's degree in political science, political economy, and international affairs. Layan will give us a general introduction today about the climate finance and how feminists can leverage climate finance for gender equality. Very honored to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you very much for the really kind introduction, Samah, and it's a great honor to be here. I have a PowerPoint that I want to share, and I apologize in advance. It has way more slides than I can get into detail into, but hopefully the organizers are willing to share it for those of you that are interested. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, don't have to spend much time on the gender dimension of climate change impacts and the questions of agency and voice. I know a lot of our speakers will talk to that, and great to see you as well, Hadil. Great to be here with you. Just pointing out quickly that the inequalities and injustices that make many women in the world so much more susceptible to the impacts of climate change have been aggravated through the multiple intersecting crises that we've seen over the last couple of years. So issues like poverty, the number of women that are without access to electricity and still cooking with traditional biomass, all of this is actually increasing. And the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has highlighted just more recently in its new reports that have come out as part of the sixth assessment, how important gender equality and the effective participation of women is for all climate action. Next slide, please. So there are a number of reasons for why we need gender responsive climate funds and funding processes. The most important one, it's the right thing to do. It's a matter of human rights, women's rights as universal rights, as part of the obligations that all parties to the Climate Framework Convention have taken on. It's also a matter of equity, effectiveness, and efficiency. We are looking at the use of very scarce resources, and we cannot ignore 50% of the population in the implementation. Also, while we have made significant progress over the last 10 years with a lot of funds, most of the relevant funds have now gender policies and gender action plans. We nevertheless see that there are structural impediments and a lack of prioritization to allow women and feminist groups, for example, to access climate finance. Next slide. All of that discussion has to be put in the context of the broader climate justice and the broader inavailability and insufficiency of climate finance provision. And I don't want to go here into detail, just want to point out that of the public climate finance that is provided, most is still for mitigation, with just 21% for adaptation. Most is still provided in loans, in the form of loans, including for adaptation. A lot of it is provided through the multilateral development banks, where, of course, there is a dominance of developed countries, donors in the governance structure, which is why we really need to push for an increase of financing that flows through the funds that are structured under the UNFCCC, under the UN system, where we have one country, one vote. The lack of available finance overall of public finance is a significant climate and gender justice issue, because when we have the bad quality of climate finance in the form of loans, that leads to the increasing indebtedness with unsustainable debt levels in developing country. We have the reduced fiscal space that governments have, and we know, unfortunately, that is usually coming at the expense of social safety provisions, and where we then see that women are basically acting as a social defense of last resort for care and support, and have to do that on top of already disproportionate impacts experienced due to the intersecting crisis. So increasing public finance for adaptation channeled through multilateral funds is really important. And I want to also point out, because this is an important part of the discourse, the setting up a loss and damage finance facility, acknowledging that there are losses and damage already occurring, is really important. Next slide, please. Just really quickly, why is it so important in mitigation to take gender into account, to have a feminist approach to funding mitigation actions? There, it's very important to focus actually on energy poverty, the affordability of access. And that is often not addressed because we have the bias of many actors in the climate finance field towards big infrastructure activities. We also see a lot of focus on false solutions that can violate women's human rights. And I bring here the example of large hydro, but also biofuel production with the impending food insecurity issues. Next slide, please. When we are looking at adaptation finance, and again, the big problem is that adaptation is crucially underfunded. In a lot of cases, we have a challenge to the provision of grant financing, and it's really important to have grant financing, and particularly full cost grant financing, meaning no requirement to bring up co-financing, and no requirement to basically indicate that you already have a baseline development financing. And it's crucially important that more adaptation finance is made available for social protection programs, for cash transfer models, and not just for infrastructure. And unfortunately, this is very often not the case. What we need particularly is small grant facility approaches. A number of those are already existent. And for example, the JEF UNDP Small Grants program, the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund have some of them, but way too little. Next slide, please. Quickly pointing out the importance of private sector finance, because a lot of public funds are supporting the private sector there. In order to be gender responsive and really take women's needs into account, we need to look particularly at micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise approaches, and there particularly on the micro and small enterprise approaches, and deal with the fact that a lot of those women entrepreneurs, women-led enterprises actually do not have access to finance. So to the extent that public climate funds are supporting such approaches, we need to ensure that we focus particularly on the micro and small segment, and that they actually ensure that the concessionality of the public finance is passed on to the entrepreneurs in form, for example, of small-scale loans that have a reduced interest rate or an extended maturity rate. Next slide, please. Just really quickly, a couple of numbers, and this is from Oxfam's Climate Finance Shadow Report 2020. We know that only about a third of climate finance projects are even designed to respond to gender differentiated needs, and only 1.5% of the climate-related overseas development assistance actually says gender equality is a primary objective, which means that 2/3 of all climate programs don't even look for gender equality impacts or see gender equality as an important objective. Next slide, please. So when you then actually look how much money is particularly accessible to women's group and feminist group, it's only a tiny percent. So it's about 1.8% of the money that is channeled through NGOs for climate purposes, but of the overall finance is actually less than 1%. It's like 0.1%. It's a ridiculous small amount. That means that money from official climate finance flows that is going to women-led and women's rights organizations and feminist organizations is really negligible. We also know that it's actually hard to track, and by some accounts, less than 10% of climate finance reaches the local level. There are lots of reasons for that. The biggest are that there are structural impediments and a lack of priority, because the dedicated climate funds provide very little access to finance for women, marginalized gender groups, and feminist organizations, and are not prioritizing them as direct beneficiaries of many of the actions. So what we can see is actually that the trickle down via larger accredited entities, like, for example, the UN agencies or multilateral development banks that do have access to the funds, or some government agencies, really has not worked. So what we need is a focus on applying the principle of subsidiarity, which basically says we need to focus on implementing on the lowest level possible with progressively increasing targets. And we need to make sure that we have, for example, small grants facility approaches, that we create direct access opportunities, and again, in the private sector, focus on MSMEs. Next slide, please. This is basically an overview of the UN, the global climate finance architecture. The red circle part is the funds that I've been working mostly with, which is the funds that are under the UNFCCC. Next slide. That provides an overview, and we can't go into that because we don't have the time, of what has actually happened over the past 10 years in terms of integration of gender responsiveness in both the UNFCCC system, as well as the funds that are under the UNFCCC, the major multilateral climate funds. Just to basically say, quite a bit has happened in terms of formal integration. so in the form of having official gender action plans or gender policies in those various funds, but that does not necessarily translate yet into the kind of gender responsive, feminist minded climate finance that we want to see. Next slide. Next slide. I'm speeding through now. Next slide. Some of the core challenges, and this is one of the next to last slides, but I want to spend just a little bit on time on this one particularly. Some of the core challenges in implementing climate funds existing gender mandates are exactly as I had mentioned. They are funded by gender policy and gender action plans and related mandates, but those by themselves are not enough. What we are seeing missing is a systematic integration of gender equality considerations. And we need that as well in fund governance, in the operational procedures, but particularly also in the technical expert bodies, the one that do the evaluation of, for example, a funding proposal, in decision-making processes, and the management and the staff culture. And that includes, for example, a zero tolerance for sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So what we see right now is very often gender comes into play, gender considerations comes into play, but as an add-on. That means you still design your project as you normally would, but then you put a little bit of gender into it, but you really don't go towards addressing systemic inequalities, inequities and power imbalances. Also, most of the funds still have a binary gender understanding. So intersectionality, sexual identities, different gender identities are not sufficiently acknowledged and incorporated. And we are just starting with some of the discourse here. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last one, and I think I'm already 1 minute over, so I'm going really quickly through that here. So just again, a summary of a couple of the core recommendations. Really important, and I hope I made that clear, that gender responsive climate finance is a matter of climate justice and gender justice. This is absolutely inseparable, and that's why I pointed out at the beginning the importance of really focusing also as a feminist advocacy on the availability of sufficient public climate finance and inequality that actually is supportive of women's concern. Again, which is why it's needed to improve both the quality and the quantity of climate finance provision. This is why we need to especially increase the finance provision for adaptation as grants and the delivery through more concessional multilateral climate finance channels that are accountable under the climate agreement and particularly the Paris Agreement. We need to also increase the share of climate-related assistance that supports gender equality as a principal focus. This is a challenge to the developed countries that usually classify whether climate-related assistance is actually also fulfilling the goal of supporting gender equality. We need to get away from what is very often in climate processes a false dividing line between development and adaptation, particularly for the local implementation. This has financing implications because this is the incremental cost approach that usually comes where you assume that somebody else covers the development backline and then climate funds just top it off. That leads to a lot of problems on the ground. What we actually really need to do is go to full cost financing. We need to expand the opportunities for direct access to finance for local groups and women's groups. Transparency and reporting is an issue. What is not reported does often not count. And the reporting in climate funds and in the larger climate system on the gender responsiveness of climate finance is still very much lacking. And we then need a lot of help for those that can actually access climate finance already, some of the implementing entities who very often don't have enough of an own gender capacity or an own gender understanding. So I would leave it at that. Again, I apologize. I know I've been longer there is a lot more to say. Hopefully we have a chance in the question and answers to get into some of those questions, and I appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for sharing your wisdom with us and introducing us with general information about the climate finance and how feminists can leverage climate finance for gender equality. I would like also to invite our participants to share with us their thoughts and reflections using the chat and their questions using the Q&A option. So we can share your questions with the speakers at the end of the webinar and do our discussion regarding the answers. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Valerie Main. Valerie is a knowledge broker at Oxfam Climate Initiative. Oxfam and CARE carried out research and learning project with the goal of identifying the perspectives of feminist organizations and women's rights organizations on their experience of collaboration with international NGOs and drawing lessons from their views, ideas, and ways of working. The project was implemented in early 2022 in West, East, South, and the Horn of Africa. Valerie will share her key findings and recommendations for collaboration with feminist and women's rights organizations to further the gender and climate justice agenda. Valerie, you're welcome. Very honored to have you with us today.
Thank you, Sama. Thank you also for the very nice introduction, and very happy to take part of today's webinar. So as Sama was saying, I'm going to talk a bit about this research and learning project we did in collaboration Oxfam with CARE, basically with the goal of listening to feminist and women's rights organizations that were working on this nexus of gender and climate justice, and listen to their experiences and concerns. No? As Sama was saying, in the three regions, West Africa, Heka, and Southern Africa. And the project had a couple of stages we went through. Now, first, we did more of a mapping to get a view of who are the organizations we were not necessarily partnering with, women's rights organizations, feminist organizations. And then we had interviews and focus group discussions with the organizations. And this work has been supported also by a consultant, Yvonne Maingley. She's a feminist climate activist from Kenya, and she has really supported this project. And once we finished that, we had a listening circle within CARE and one within Oxfam, where we would listen to what these organizations had to say and reflect on what would this mean for us and what we could do within Oxfam. And lastly, we're also now taking out two papers, one internal learning paper for Oxfam and one paper that's for INGOs, that's co-written with the women's rights organizations that participated in this project. Okay, so in terms of methodology, we spoke with two types of organizations. So one would be the local grassroots organizations that are based in the region. But we also spoke to more global women's rights and feminist organizations that have a focus on the African continent. And we wanted to get an understanding of these two types of organizations that are working on the gender and climate issues, on what are their expectations, their priorities, what are they focusing on, and is Oxfam doing a good enough job in supporting them? And what does collaboration look like between a big INGO like Oxfam and these organizations? And are there things that we should be thinking about that we are not necessarily thinking about? And this has been a really interesting journey. So actually, we first started with this project, a lot of questions for the organizations focusing on how do you work the gender climate nexus, partnerships, and we heard from them a very clear concern, a criticism as to how we, as Oxfam, work together and we collaborate and we partner with feminist and women's rights organizations. And the research therefore really focused a lot more on these critical issues on partnerships, and that were expressed by these organizations. So, and we also acknowledge that these issues that I will explain you, they're not limited around our climate work, and they're not limited to Africa, and it really represents challenges that are inherent in our ways of working, and how do we collaborate in general. as Oxfam or as big INGOs. So what have we been hearing from these organizations about Oxfam and their partnerships with INGOs? So on one hand, you had the very local grassroots organizations, and they are very much working and having a focus in the region, and they had a more, let's say, positive outlook about the INGOs like Oxfam. So for them, the challenges were more in the lines of accessing to the NGO, like accessing staff and how they could get access to financing, and how could finance trickle down to the small organizations. And a lot of these organizations are very, very grassroots, so they don't have a website. You need to get on the phone to talk to them. So access was one of their major concerns. So suggestions they gave on moving forward and improving accessibility would be to enable women's rights organizations to make contact more easily. So they shouldn't rely on having personal connections with staff in the international NGO. And whereas for the global organizations that have a focus on Africa, there was a lot more, there was a strong critical view of Oxfam and international NGOs in general that want to work with women's rights organizations and feminist movement. Like the first thing that we heard these organizations telling us is that, like, listen, you need to stop lumping together all the women's rights organizations with feminist organizations. They're not the same. Not all women's rights organizations are feminist. And how can you be saying that you are applying a feminist perspective if, as an organization, you don't see these organizations as distinct? And then the suggestions for INGOs would be to have more clarity on, let's say, characteristics on what a feminist organization is. So one criteria, for example, should be that women form a critical part of the leadership team. And it's true, for example, we had one organization as part of our mapping we talked to, which was a group of 5 men leading a women's rights organization. So for Oxfam, are we defining this? And how are we defining this? And another suggestion was also to really recognize the body of work of African feminists. Like, instead of trying to define our own agenda, they have been working and thinking about this. It already exists and it's well documented. So let's acknowledge that. And another issue that was mentioned was that, and across the board, global and more grassroots organizations, they were saying, are you really concerned about meaningful, qualitative participation with us, the women's rights organization? Because it seems like Oxfam is ticking a box, like we got their perspectives checked, no? And that feels very tokenistic, it feels very extractive. And one organization said, for example, so you come and you say that Oxfam really cares about our voice, but would Oxfam really be willing to leave their seats to us in global events? And if not, how can you say you are really representing the voices and ideals of the feminist organizations? So suggestions there would be to really reflect for us, Oxfam, on the space we take, to use, let's say, the power and privilege to open space for women's rights organizations and to support their messages. Are we, for example, willing to give up our seats in COP27 and ensure that voices from grassroots feminist organizations are heard? And I was also mentioning the exploitative part, and women's rights organizations, they also feel like NGOs would come, they would sit with them, take their perspectives, and then they would never hear back from them. They don't know what happened to their input, they don't know what it was used for, and also a lot of times no, for example, in a final paper, no attributions would be given to their input. And also the organizations feel like they don't get any support for their contributions. So for example, for travel or the time they dedicate to what the INGOs ask from them, no? So for grassroots organizations, then it gets really difficult to participate. So organizations feel like they are giving in, but they're not being recognized and supported enough for it. And another issue that was raised was that women's rights organizations feel that big INGOs, they take over, they take credit, they dictate what partnerships should look like. And even if Oxfam states that they are a feminist organization, that our ways of working are feminist, but they feel like Oxfam is looking to model, to fit fit the donor box, to fit the narrative. Whereas it should be the other way around, a more feminist way, like NGOs should be looking at the needs and ways of expressing of these organizations and tailor how we apply the donor, how we apply for donor funding and how we cater our programs to meet these needs. And here it's important really to address this unequal power relation, the still colonial relationship that exists now, and this will be key to the nature of our partnerships. And there's also this need to shift from thinking of capacity building more to an approach of capacity sharing, not having so much the top-down approach, and a more partnerships that are based on equity and inclusivity. And I think as Oxfam, we can have a lot more our role as connector or broker rather than being the lead organization. We can think of new ways of working where we co-create and co-design programs, where we allow leadership from the women's rights organization and promote collective accountability. And the last point I wanted to mention, so I have no idea how I go with time, is the one about funding. So the funding that's out there for climate justice work needs to really be channeled to these organizations that are working on the front line. And really very few funding gets to grassroots feminist organizations and movements. So many of these organizations don't have any formal structures, and the reality makes it difficult to scale funding. So we need to figure out a way around our Oxfam very bureaucratic donor-like structures that is very much about compliance, and find new ways to collaborate and fund these organizations. So great, thank you. So suggestions they were having was to really make sure that we see ways how we can channel more funding to these organizations, involve representatives from these organizations, from the really grassroots organizations, women's rights organizations, as experts and leaders in designing, managing, evaluating our funding mechanisms. And then there's really a need to change our own funding architecture, because we need to have more adaptable, flexible, and needs-based funding. And we've seen some examples within Oxfam that are already doing this and piloting this, and I think we can learn a lot from sharing some of these examples. And yeah, these were just some of the most significant findings. And maybe to say that these organizations are really passionate about what they do. They really see the need to collaborate, but they also feel like it's not going to be done through, if it's not going to be done through a feminist approach, then it is not participation that they see useful for their work. So I think now it's up to us, to Oxfam, to think about what is our approach and how do we put feminism in practice, and what is going to be our approach of collaborating and partnerships with these organizations. And that's it from my part.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for sharing the challenges that you have faced, and how did you deal with these challenges. Is so inspiring. And I found it outstanding between like how people take it as well for granted sometimes, between the difference between women organizations and feminist organization, and how to have a category to be able to identify it and find the difference between them two. Thank you so much for sharing. Our next speaker is Shireen Talat. Shireen is going to speak in Arabic, so this is an indicator for our English speakers audience to activate their interpretations. Shireen is the co-director of Arab Watch Coalition. She has more than 17 years experience in working with different local communities around the MENA region as a filmmaker and a campaigner for social justice issues. In 2014, she became a part of a group with other researchers and civil society activists from Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, Tunisia. And together they worked on international financial institutions, policies, and projects, especially the World Bank. After more than 4 years of reviewing the policies, joining the campaigns, and engaging with the World Bank on local and regional level, she became one of the founders of the Arab Watch regional team. And Shireen here with us today to present what can we do towards working collectively against climate change and what are the opportunities that we all have. Shireen, very honored to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Sameh. And thanks for my colleagues here, Valeria and Leanne, and the other colleagues who are going to present. I'm going to speak in Arabic. شكرا لكم جدا. أنا سعيدة جدا بالpresentations اللي كانت قبلي. أنا بسمع الترجمة، أنا آسفة. سعيدة جدا بالpresentations اللي كانت قبلي لأنها قوية جدا، وفي الحقيقة بتمهد للي أنا محتاجة أتكلم فيه. شكرا ليان على المعلومات القيمة اللي انت شاركتيها معانا، ومهم نعرف ازاي نبني عليه. فاليري، التحديات واضحة جدا جدا. أنا بشكرك على حماستك وعلى وضوحك، لأنه ده اللي احنا بنتكلم فيه دلوقتي، ازاي نقدر نشتغل على إن احنا نبني حركة نسوية من أجل المناخ، واللي هي في الحقيقة وجودها ضعيف. في حركات من أجل المناخ مختلفة، ولكن مش قوية في الحقيقة، عشان أبقى واضحة، يعني مش قوية بالدرجة اللي المفروض تكونوا. فبالتالي للأسف الحركات النسوية من أجل المناخ هي كمان نقدر نقول حركات أو مجموعات بتشتغل بشكل فردي، أو يعني مش بتشتغل بشكل كولكتيف حقيقي، مش بتشتغل، ما عندهاش الدعم الكافي. كمان جزء له علاقة بالمعرفة أو المعلومات اللي بالضرورة تبقى عند الحركات المهتمة تشتغل على المناخ مفقود. منها الجزء الخاص باللي أنا بشتغل عليه، وهو مراقبة المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى. لأنه لو احنا بنتكلم على تمويل المناخ وتمويل الخاص بالطاقات المتجددة والتمويلات يعني الخاصة بالأمر المرتبط سواء بالمناخ أو بالطاقات المتجددة أو حتى بالأمر المرتبط بالبيئة، هي تمويلات والسياسات بتضعها في الأصل المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى، زي المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى اللي احنا بنراقبهم في كأرب واتش، كتحالف أرب واتش، هي المؤسسات العامة التنموية زي البنك الدولي بأذرعه المختلفة، فالبنك الدولي ومؤسسة التمويل الدولية، EBRD بنك التنمية الإعمار الأوروبي، EIB بنك الاستثمار الأوروبي، أفريكان ديفلوبمنت بانك، إلى آخره من هذه البنوك، بالإضافة إلى صندوق النقد الدولي اللي ابتدى مؤخرا من تقريبا السنة اللي فاتت يراجع سياساته الخاصة بالمناخ. هي كانت سياسات موجودة مركونة على الرف، إنما مؤخرا ابتدى يراجع سياساته الخاصة بالمناخ، اللي في رأينا كبنك ووتشرز أو مراقبين بنوك أو واتش دوجز أو وات ايفر هي ضعيفة جدا وفيها جابس كبيرة، زي بالظبط البوليسي اللي حطها للجندر مؤخرا، وكمان فيها يعني مناطق ضعف كبيرة، والجزء اللي بيتكلموا فيه على النساء وحقوق النساء هو ضعيف. يمكن كمان المعرفة المرتبطة بالنسوية مختلطة جدا جدا فيما له علاقة بحقوق النساء، ولأن المؤسسات دي ما بتتكلمش لغة حقوق الإنسان بالمرة، فدورنا كمجموعات كحركات نسوية بتشتغل على الأرض أو مهتم أو نسويات منضمة لحركات مختلفة، إنه الصوت ده يكون واضح والصوت ده يكون مسموع بشكل أصيل وحقيقي. في حركات على المستوى العالمي موجوده علشان تراقب هذه العمليات التمويليه، ولكن ايضا مهم ربط التحركات العالميه. عمر ما التحركات العالميه في رايي ومن وجهه نظر تحالفنا ارب واتش انه هتكون جيده او ناجعه من غير ما يبقى فيه، من غير ما تربط بالتحركات المحليه على الارض، ومن غير ما تساهم في بناء حركه اجتماعيه حقيقيه. وانا وفي رايي على مدار السنين الحركات النسويه ساهمت في بناء او كانت الكور في حركات اجتماعيه مهمه على مدار التاريخ. مش هنقدر ننكر ان النسويه equal يعني عداله اجتماعيه، وهو ده اللي الاصل والمغزى. لما ما ينفعش اقول عداله اقتصاديه من غير ما اقول عداله اجتماعيه، من غير ما اقول نسويه. ما ينفعش اقول عداله مناخيه، عداله في سياسات المناخ، عداله في المشاريع الطاقيه، من غير ما اقول عداله اجتماعيه، من غير ما اقول نسويه. فالامر مرتبط ببعضه، واحنا وده اللي محتاجين نشتغل ونبلوره. جزء تاني من ايه اللي يخلينا نقدر نبني تحركات او حركات او مجموعات يعني نسويه ناجعه في قضايا المناخ، هي ان احنا محتاجين، طبعا هتكلم عن التمويل في الجزء الاخر، لانه انا فاهمه انه ده كور وحاجه مهمه جدا، ومش يعني للاسف دونرز كتيره او ممولين كتير على مستوى العالم مش بيشتغلوا بشكل جيد على المستوى المحلي. بس ده هنا يجي دور الانترناشونال او منظمات المجتمع المدني الدوليه، انها عن طريق العلاقات اللي موجوده معاها على الارض تقدر توصل ده بده. لكن هتكلم فيه بعد شويه، وهتكلم ايه الفرص برضه. وهحط ايميلي في الشات لاني هضطر امشي، انا عندي كورونا وحرارتي عاليه، انا اسفه جدا. لكن زي ما قلت الحركات النسويه كانت كور لحراك اجتماعي مهم حصل على مدار التاريخ. فبالضروره علشان نقدر نبني حراك من اجل المناخ جيد متماسك، لازم احنا كمان كنسويات نبذل مجهود في ربط القضايا ببعضها. يعني ما ينفعش اشتغل على القضيه النسويه بمعزل مثلا عن المديونيه، بمعزل عن السياسات التقشفيه، ما اقدرش. وعشان اقدر اشتغل على قضايا المناخ كنسويه بالضروره اربطها، انا في رايي عشان نقدر نحقق نجاحات بالضروره يتم ربطها باليومي اللي بنعيشه، لان احنا بنتكلم على حركات شعبيه، حركات قاعديه على جراس روتس. علشان تقدري تقدر تخلي الجراس روت، انا مش عايزه، انا اسفه جدا للمترجمين ان انا بخلط عربي وانجليزي مع بعض، انا اسفه جدا. بس عشان تشتغل على حركات قاعديه بالضروره لازم تربط المفهوم الكبير اللي يبان تقني بحت، وهو مش تقني بحت بالمناسبه، هو يومي جدا وهو بيلمس حياتنا بشكل كبير جدا. لازم نقدر نربطه، لازم نقدر نربط كمان القضايا الجلوبال، مش بس العالميه، هي قضايا عالميه بتاثر علينا بشكل يومي، بتاثر على اقتصادنا، بتاثر على حياتنا بشكل يومي كمواطنين، مش فقط ناس مؤدلجين. لازم نربطها بالارض. فما ينفعش بس اتكلم على المناخ من منظور نسوي من غير ما اتكلم على السياسات التقشفيه، من غير ما اتكلم على الازمه العالميه اللي احنا كلنا بنعيشها الوقت ده، سواء ازمه غذاء او ازمه مناخ. فده اللي كنت عايزه اقوله، مش عايزه اخد وقت طويل. بالنسبه للتمويل، وزي ما قلنا انه دور المؤسسات، احنا كأرب واتش بنشتغل بشكل اقليمي، احنا تحالف اقليمي قوامنا هو مجموعات قاعديه من الجراس روت اورجانيزيشنز والناشونال اورجانيزيشنز، لكن عندنا بارتنرز، عندنا شركاء في المنطقه من يعني الان جي اوز الانترناشونال، انا اسفه المترجمين، سواء في المنطقه او سواء في العالم، من ضمنهم طبعا اوكسفام وكفينه الكفينه. واحنا واوكسفام بنشتغل كمان يعني بشكل متقارب قوي مع بعض في قضايا عده، من ضمنها قضايا التقشف والمديونيه. فدور المؤسسات الكبيره اللي عندها علاقات بالمجتمعات المحليه انها تعمل الكونكشن ده، وانها تبتدي تترافع من اجل توفير تمويلات للمجتمعات المحليه، وخصوصا المجموعات النسويه، لانه للاسف على بعض الاجندات الحركات النسويه لانها منفصله مش طول الوقت، لكن بعض الوقت منفصله عن القضايا المختلفه اللي احنا بنتكلم فيها النهارده، فهي ما بتلاقيش الدعم الكافي. ده الجزء الثاني، انا عضو في وده موجه للمجموعات اللي حاضره معانا هنا من الجمعيات الصغيره والجمعيات القاعديه اللي شايفه انها تقدر تشتغل على ملف المناخ. انا عضوه في المجلس الاستشاري لجي اف جرين جلوبال فاند، او صندوق المنح الخضراء. صندوق المنح الخضراء بيدي منح صغيره من 5000 ل 10000 دولار، يبقى المشروع متعلق بالمناخ، ويبقى المشروع بيساهم في بناء حراك اجتماعي. عندنا جزء مخصص للنساء في الفض، فأرجوكم ما تترددوش. احنا عندنا دورة تقريبا كل 6 شهور، احنا فاتحين باب التقديم. انا هشارك الايميل بتاعي معاكم وايميلي عند زمايلنا في كفينة الكفينة. أرجوكم تواصلوا معايا اني تايم، علشان البروسيس سهله جدا وبسيطه جدا علشان تقدروا تقدموا. تاني، لازم المنظمه تبقى الميزانيه بتاعتها اقل من 100,000 في السنه، 100,000 دولار اكيد يعني في السنه، ولازم تبقى المشروع اللي بيشتغلوا عليه يبقى بيساهم في حراك اجتماعي زي ما قلنا، وبيشتغل على المناخ او قضايا بيئيه متعلقه بالمناخ ايضا، لان قضايا البيئه مختلفه عن قضايا المناخ، ودي قصه اخرى لما نتكلم فيها. وكمان مش بالضروره جدا تبقى جمعيه مشهره او مدلله، اللي احنا فاهمين الوضع كويس في المنطقه شكله عامل ازاي، انما ممكن تبقى مجموعه مستفيدين، او مجموعه effective people، يعني اصحاب حقوق، او زي عندنا مجموعات مثلا في تونس، هو مجموعات من الصيادين في جربه وغيره. عندنا مجموعات كمان كذلك في العراق وفي اليمن، من اللي استفادوا من الدعم بتاع الجي اف. مجموعات في المغرب، بطبيعه الحال انا مصريه لكن مقيمه في المغرب، مصر كذلك الى اخره. انا اسفه جدا للاطاله وبشكركم.
شكرا كثير لك شيرين، بالعكس على الوقت. شكرا كثير لانك شاركتينا عن الحركه النسويه وعن بنائها، عمليه بنائها، وعن التحديات اللي هي بتلاقيها، وعن كمان مراقبه المؤسسات الكبرى والعمليات التمويليه، وكمان بما انك شاركتينا عن صندوق المنح الخضراء، وكمان دعمتينا بانك تشاركينا الايميل تبعك على الشات. وبتشكرك كثير لو تقدري كمان تشاركي. شكرا كثير لك شيرين. I want to also encourage everyone to share their questions and thoughts with us using the question and answer option or using the chat. And now we're going to go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Rania Herrera. Rania is an 18 years old youth political leader, a community builder, and an outspoken advocate for gender equality and Arab youth inclusion in decision-making spaces. She is an organizer at Fridays for Future Morocco, a leader at the Gender Equality, Climate and Sustainable Action Group at Girl Up campaign, where she works on advocacy guide for young leaders between the age of 13 to 24, educating them on the relationship between the climate action and gender equality. She also led regional consultation to represent Arab youth demands at the Vienna Cafe. Rania will be discussing how to build a climate movement as a youth in the MENA region. And she also will talk to us regarding the intersections between gender equality and climate justice, and share with us the importance of MENA youth voices in the climate justice fight, and how to get involved in the climate justice movement as youth in the MENA region. Dania, very happy and honored to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I think it's very important when we talk about climate justice to talk about gender equality, but also people of color and disadvantaged communities' voices. I think that MENA youth voice is very critical to the climate fight and climate justice. We live experiences that people from other regions in the world don't experience. Let's just think about the context of MENA. In a majority of countries, there's wars, economic crisis. People have other priorities than just advocate for climate justice. And as I always say, I really believe that advocacy and being able to build those movements is a luxury and a privilege that people from MENA region don't have access to. Let's also not forget that organizing protests and the process of organizing those protests is not as facilitated and easy in MENA-based countries. I feel like the main way in order to build movements as youths in the MENA region is to educate, because people don't really understand the importance of achieving climate justice in the MENA region. People have other priorities. People have families to feed, they have degrees to get, they have lives to survive. Actually, people main goal in the MENA region is to survive and don't really get the chance to understand the importance of climate justice and how climate justice intersect with other economic justice, social justice, gender equality. And I feel like the main way that we can really build those movements and advocate as youths is to educate people surrounding us. It can start like an educational boot camp for young people in your region, or trying to have those conversations with people who are older than you, because I feel like it's by understanding the problem that we're going to understand how bad the situation is, then we're going to start to try to find solution to advocate for. Because I feel like a lot of people don't understand how climate justice is critical and how it's important to understand its intersection with other movements. I feel like people in the MENA region don't really understand how important it is, because they are not directly affected by it, except for farmers and other jobs. But I feel like they don't really feel the direct effects of it. And I feel like one of the ways to make them connect with the climate justice fight is to make it relate and intersect with other fights and other struggles that they're going through. I feel like it's also very challenging and hard to engage Arab youth or MENA-based youth because we feel like youth in the region is very disconnected from these struggles and don't perceive them as their priority. For my work with UN Women in CSW, we found it very challenging just to sit down with them and have a chat, like how is climate affecting you? How do you see climate justice for you? What does it mean for you? And I feel like having those conversations really matter, because it's increased youth engagement in the region. In a lot of those advocacy spaces and also decision-making spaces, it's very hard to find young people from our region with common struggles and who had to go through very common and lived experiences that we had. So I feel like one of the ways to build a climate movement is to educate, because by educating people, you will have more people who are like, oh, this is wrong, we should do something about it. So those people are going to be trying also to get involved and look through how they can advocate. And I feel like also how you can also just try to reach out to people who have more experience than you in general. For example, to organizations, for example, reach out to, I don't know, UN Women, to Plan International, to other also NGOs based in your region, and Let them know that you want to get involved. Let them know that you want to get engaged. Let them know that you have ideas. Be creative. Think about how you can like involve youth from your region, because I feel like as youth, we know how we can get involved and how we can encourage other people our age to get involved. So I feel like reach out. People are willing to help, and be creative on your ways on how you can advocate. For example, we found like it was very hard for people to learn how to start advocacy. For people who didn't grow up in environments surrounded by activists and advocates. That's why with Girl Up campaign, we are working on building an advocacy guide for young people, how like small changes and small steps can make a change and build a movement. A movement is not built on one night. It's built on baby steps. It's built on little progress. So I feel like reaching out people who have to people who have experience, it's totally okay to not know how to start advocating, and that's why you need to reach out to people who have experience. I feel like how we can also get involved as youth in the MENA region is to by starting local chapters of big NGOs who are willing to support you financially, to organize those protests or educational camps, those workshops. For example, before getting involved with Fridays for Future Morocco, I was involved with Fridays for Future MAPA, and we were doing things online, strikes online, because we understand that people based in the most vulnerable countries and regions in the world don't actually have the privilege of going out and protesting, don't have the privilege of holding those placards and protesting. That's why with MAPA, we try to create this digital strike space for people who don't actually have the privilege to go out. So I feel like maybe trying to get started online, advocating, educating, and also trying to build groups and movements in your community. I feel like it's by joining Fridays for Future MAPA that I found people based in Morocco, and then we decided, oh, maybe we should try something locally, and we started Fridays for Future Morocco. So I feel like it's literally trying to find like-minded people online, because not everyone has the privilege to find those people, to be in those environments where those people live in, to be able to start those movements. And also, let's not forget that MENA youth is the most affected youth in the world by climate change. By 2050, MENA region won't be livable. So I feel like it's our struggle, and as I always say, our struggle, our voice, pass the stage, not the mic. Because what I realize in those climate justice spaces is that people are willing to listen to you, but are not willing to give you the mic. So one advice that I would give to any young person in those movements, or wanting to get started on building movements and building advocacy and making a change, ask for the mic. Don't just ask them to give you a space, because a space is not enough. I feel like no one is better at telling your story and your struggles than yourself. And that's why I feel like as youth from MENA, we should own our spaces, and don't take no for an answer when it comes to taking space, and hold people accountable. I feel like accountability is something that we struggle to do as youth in the region for a lot of political reasons. We are never really encouraged to hold accountable those big companies or political leaders in our countries. But I feel like it's one of the steps that we can build those movements and encourage advocacy is having the courage to call out people in leadership positions who are affecting us, because at the end of the day, we're the people who are going to be taking the lead when they're going to leave. So I feel like we should all start those movements and advocacy by calling them out and trying to collaborate, also by finding solutions. Also, I feel like there's no climate justice without gender equality. Women, more than 80% of women are under poverty in the world. We are one of the most affected populations by poverty. And also, when climate change arises, gender-based violence incidents also arises, child marriage cases arises. So I feel like we can't achieve gender equality without climate justice. And that's something that we need also to collaboratively work on, is to understand that putting more girls in school is related to achieving climate justice. Reducing climate change and achieving environmental justice means more girls in school, less child marriage, less gender-based violence, more gender equality. And that's something a lot of people don't really can understand, because most of those people in position and leadership positions are men. And I know it's very hard for people to understand something they can't live. So that's why I feel like in order to achieve climate justice and gender equality, we need more women in those leadership positions. We need more women in those decision-making spaces, because without more women, without more representation of youth and also women from our region, we're never gonna get what we want. We're never gonna get, they're never gonna do us justice, because you can't find solutions to something you never experienced. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak.
Thank you so much, Rania, for sharing with us and highlighting your work with focusing on the importance of educating youth about the climate justice, and how your work focus on raising the agency of people before taking the actions, to understand where their motivation and why they should act today, not tomorrow. And the importance of encouraging youth in our own communities, thinking about many people by what you are sharing, and the importance of giving them the space and enabling their leadership to take actions in their communities. Thank you so much for sharing, Rania. And I want to encourage our participants, our attendants, for sharing their thoughts with us in the chat and sharing their questions that we can raise to our speakers by the end of the webinar. Our next speaker is Sumaya Al-Baushi, and Sumaya is going to speak in Arabic. So this is an indicator for our English speakers to activate the interpretations. متحدثتنا الأخيرة هي سمية الباوشي، وهي خبيرة وباحثة في النوع الاجتماعي، ولها 35 سنة من العمل الميداني بالمجتمع المدني والتغيرات المناخية، وهي معدة ورقة وجهات نظر نسوية حول الاقتصاد المناصر للبيئة في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا، معدة دليل المعارف النسائية بشأن التغيرات المناخية نموذج المغرب، وكلاهما كانوا لفائدة مؤسسة فريدريش أيبرت، وهي مساهمة في إعداد دليل إدماج الشباب في الشأن المحلي مع منظمة التعاون والتنمية الاقتصادية. اختيرت من قبل الوكالة الأمريكية للتنمية الدولية كشخصية من ضمن 50 شخصية الأكثر تأثيراً في المجتمع، وهي رئيسة جمعية نساء بلادي للتنمية والسياحة، وهي جمعية كعضو ملاحظ لاتفاقية الإطار للأمم المتحدة بخصوص التغيرات المناخية، نقطة التواصل مع الاتفاقية الإطار للأمم المتحدة بخصوص التغيرات المناخية، وهي عضو المكتب التنفيذي للمنظمة المغربية لحقوق الإنسان. وسمية سوف تتحدث اليوم معنا في مداخلتها عن الإمكانات المتاحة لنا كنسويات لتحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين من خلال تقوية تواجدنا بمؤتمرات الأطراف والمرافعة من أجل المشاركة الفعلية في بناء السياسات المتعلقة بالتغيرات المناخية. سعيدين جدا بوجودك وتشرفنا بوجودك معنا سمية، الميكروفون لك.
شكرا جزيلا لكم، سعيدة جدا أن أتواجد معكم اليوم في هذا اللقاء، وكنت سعيدة باستماع لكل المداخلات للصديقات التي سبقنا في المداخلة. سوف لم أعيد ما قيل، أن هناك العديد من النقاط التي أثيرت في المداخلات السابقة، لكن دعونا نؤكد على شيء مهم في البداية، وهو أننا لا يمكن الآن التحدث عن كل ما تقوم به النسويات وعلى كل يعني الجهود المبذولة من طرف نسويات أو الحركات النسائية عامة دون أن ندمج بعد التغير المناخي، إن كل ما نقوم به له علاقة مباشرة بالتغيرات المناخية. أعتقد أن هذه أول نقطة يجب الاشتغال عليها، حيث أن جميع المؤسسات أو المهتمات أو المهتمين أيضا بقضايا النساء أعتقد أنه أصبح ضروري الآن إدماج بعد التغير المناخي في برامجهم من أجل الإسراع بتحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين. أعتبر أن كما أن هذا تحدي كبير، هو أيضا فرصة لنا كنسويات من أجل
سمية،
نعم.
أنا آسفة لمقاطعتك، ولكن الصوت هيك بقطع شوي، ممكن لو تقربي من الميكروفون وتعلي صوتك شوي لو سمحتي.
حاضر. قلت أن الآن الصوت واضح؟
الآن أحسن، شكرا لك. نعم.
طيب، شكرا للملاحظة. قلت بأن كما هو التغير المناخي هو تحدي بالنسبة للنساء لأنهن يعتبرن أول المتأثرات بالتغير المناخي، لأنه أيضا فرصة لنا في إطار التغيرات التي تحدث الآن. كل الاقتصاديات تتغير، حتى بناء تمويلات يتغير، يعني هناك متغيرات تحدث الآن. فهي فرصتنا كنسويات وكحركات نسائية من أجل أن نتواجد في هذا التغيير وأن نكون فاعلات في هذا التغيير، بحيث نكون متواجدات في كل عمليات اتخاذ وصنع القرار. فيجب أن نعرف أن 70% هذا معطى مهم جدا من مصدر الغذاء خاصة في الدول النامية هو تنتجه النساء. بطبيعة الحال هذا المعطى هو أيضا يترك النساء أكثر تعرض لآثار التغيرات المناخية. لكن هنا يجب أن نقوي يعني المعارف التي تمتلكها النساء. وهنا سأفتح يعني قوس للدراسة الأخيرة التي قمت بها، وهي دليل المعارف النسائية في مواجهة التغير المناخي. وهذه المعارف التقليدية التي تمتلكها النساء خاصة في القرى هي بدأت بالاندثار. ومشكورة مؤسسة فريدريش إبرت، والدراسة يمكن أن تجدونها في موقع فريدريش إبرت بالفيسبوك للشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا، وهي تتحدث عن هذه الإمكانيات التي تمتلكها المرأة، خاصة قلت المرأة القروية، في مواجهة آثار التغير المناخي. بمعنى نحن لدينا قوة، نمتلك معارف يجب أن لا تضيع منا، وهذه المعارف يجب أن تكون نقطة انطلاق يعني الترافع كنسويات كنقطة أساسية، لأن العالم كله يبحث عن حلول لمواجهة آثار التغير المناخي، ونحن لدينا حلول ذكية لمواجهة هذه الآثار. يجب أن تكون نقطة أساسية في مفاوضاتنا. أيضا معطى آخر هو أن النساء يتعرضن يعني حسب برنامج الإنمائي للأمم المتحدة 14 مرة أكثر من الرجال لآثار التغير. سأأتي على يعني الكوب، يعني على المؤتمر الأطراف للتغير المناخي. أكيد أن هناك حركات نسائية ونسوية قامت بمجهود كبير جدا وناضلت من أجل إدماج بعد النوع الاجتماعي في بناء سياسات التغير المناخي، وأيضا في حضور النساء داخل مؤتمرات الأطراف. الملاحظ من يعني وأنا شاركت في العديد من مؤتمرات الأطراف، هناك عدم مساواة في الحضور. أنا أتحدث فقط في حضور النساء والرجال داخل مؤتمرات الأطراف. أيضا على مستوى اتخاذ القرار، يعني جل المفاوضين هم رجال، فبالتالي السياسات التي تبنى هي خارج وخارج وجهات نظر النسويات الذين يبنون الآن سياسات التغير المناخي ومواجهة التغير المناخي، سواء في التخفيف ولا في التأقلم ولا في الأضرار. وهم بالتالي نحن لا نتواجد بالشكل المطلوب من أجل أن نكون حاضرات في عمليات كما قلت اتخاذ القرار. و ما يلاحظ أيضا في مؤتمرات الأطراف هو أن الجمعيات أو المؤسسات التي تشتغل على قضايا النساء والنسويات للأسف ليس لديهن اعتماد من أجل الحضور لهذا المؤتمر. فبالتالي ما أقترحه، أول شيء يجب تحديد الجمعيات التي لديها اعتمادات من أجل أن تسمح لمؤسسات أخرى بالحضور في هذه المؤتمرات، يعني لأن تعطى لدينا كوتا، وهذه الكوتا مثلا 5 مقاعد أو 10 كل على حسب المؤسسات. إذا كل جمعية تبنت مثلا جمعية نساء بلادي التي أترأسها دائما أتقاسم الكوتا مع جمعيات ومنظمات أخرى، إذا هذا يسمح لتعبئة أكثر وللتوعية النسائية داخل مؤتمرات الأطراف، لأن أنا أعتبر بأنها محطة مهمة، لأن مؤتمر الأطراف هو فرصة باللقاء برؤساء الدول، فرصة للقاء بمنظمات دولية، فرصة للقاء بالمفاوضين والمفاوضات المتواجدات بمؤتمر الأطراف من أجل أن نبلغهم بمواقفنا كنسويات وماذا نريد من هذه السياسات التي تبنى في اتجاه التغير المناخي. أيضا الخطوة الثانية هي تقوية، ليست تقوية، أنا أعتبر بأن الحركات النسائية هي الآن قوية، لأن النضال الذي قمنا به طوال سنوات مكننا من آلية الترافع، مكننا من تحقيق العديد من المكتسبات. إذن علينا تفعيل هذه القوى واستغلالها في اتجاه بناء سياسات التغير المناخي. فقط يجب علينا إدماج هذا البعد، لكن الميكانيزمات والآليات نحن نمتلكها، يعني لدينا أصلا، فبالتالي يجب تفعيلها والحضور في مؤتمرات الأطراف من أجل الضغط، أولا من أن تكون هناك مناصفة بحضور المفاوضات والمفاوضين وحضور وجهات نظر يعني النسويات داخل مؤتمرات الأطراف. إذا يجب أن أو أقترح على الحركات هي أن تشتغل على قضايا المناخ والبيئة من أجل أن يكون لديها ملف حتى تستطيع أن تحصل على اعتماد لحضور مؤتمرات الأطراف للتغير المناخي. وأيضا أصبح ضروري من تعبئة جميع الحركات والمنظمات التي تشتغل على قضايا النساء من أجل تبني مواقف، بمعنى أننا حين نريد أن نذهب إلى مؤتمر الأطراف مثلا 27 الذي سيكون في شرم الشيخ، يجب أن تكون هذه الحركات موحدة حول مطلب ما. مثلا إذا كان لدينا المطلب هو أن يكون 50% من المفاوضين نساء، من المفاوضات نساء، إذا يجب أن نشتغل على هذا المطلب بشكل موحد من أجل الضغط الكافي وتحقيق هذا المطلب داخل مؤتمرات الأطراف. لأن للأسف حتى وإن كنا في الكوب 26 كان يوم اجتماعي، ولكن شخصيا من خلال تجربتي لا زلت أحس أنه فقط تأتيت للفضاءات وليس إرادة حقيقية من أجل أن تكون المرأة حاضرة بنفس القوة التي يحضر بها الرجل. لأن وهذا طبيعي، لأن الرجل يريد أن يحتفظ بالمكتسبات خاصة في المجال الاقتصادي. إذا تحدثنا عن تمويل الصندوق الأخضر، تمويل الصندوق الأخضر، التمويلات التي تستفيد منها النساء هي تمويلات جد هزيلة. حتى الدول النامية نفسها في إطار التخفيف تستفيد فقط من 5%، يعني جل التمويلات هي تذهب للدول المتقدمة من أجل التخفيف من إنتاج ثاني أكسيد يعني الانبعاثات الدفيئة. ولكن الدول النامية والتي هي تعاني أصلا من آثار التغيرات المناخية والنساء لا يعانين أصلا من التمييز ومن يعني التفاوت بين الجنسين، تزداد الفجوة بين النساء والرجال. وهنا سأعطي مثال حي وسأتحدث عن الاقتصاد الأخضر، ولهذا كنت اخترت دراسة وجهة نظر نسوية من يعني اتجاه كيف نحن نرى أو يجب أن يكون هذا الاقتصاد الأخضر. لأن الاقتصاد الأخضر للأسف وإن كان من ضمن مبادئه هو المساواة والعدالة الاجتماعية إلى غير ذلك، إلا أننا نلاحظ أنه يتجه إلى نفس نتاج النظام الرأسمالي، وهو توسيع الفجوة الجنسين، لأن فقط الشعار هو اقتصاد أخضر، لكن المحتوى هو يكرس يعني الفجوة بين الجنسين. وبالتالي يجب أن يكون لنا وجهة نظر في هذا الاقتصاد وأن نكون حاضرات في هذا الاقتصاد. ويجب أن ننتبه لنقطة مهمة، هي أن 26 يعني مليون فرصة عمل ستخلق في أفق 2030. إذا أين نحن كنساء من هذه الفرص؟ هل نوجه طالبات من أجل أن يتوجهن في اتجاه يعني التوجهات الحديثة الجديدة للاقتصاد، مثلا الاقتصاديات الجديدة المناصرة للبيئة، أو للفرص أو التخصصات الحديثة، لأن ستغيب بعض المهن. إذا يجب أن نتوي المهن الجديدة من أجل أن نضمن أننا متواجدات في الأمكنة الصحيحة التي تؤهلنا علميا وبكل يعني على جميع الأبعاد من أجل أن نكون حاضرات في المجتمع بالشكل الذي نريده، وهو تحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين. سأعرج إذا سمحتم سأعود للمعارف التقليدية لأوضح هذه الفكرة، لأن أعتبرها جد مهمة. من المنطلق كنت أؤمن بأن للمرأة معارف واجهت بها التغيرات، خاصة كما قلت في القرية. لكن حينما نزلت إلى أن هذه المعارف للأسف بدأت تنقرض نتيجة التغيرات التي حدثت بالمجتمع. وهذه المعارف هي ثروة ثمينة لنا كنسويات، لأن يجب أن نكون على وعي وأن ندرك بأننا ساهمنا في استمرار الموارد طبيعية للأجيال. يعني الآن يعني ساهمنا في استمرار موارد طبيعية البيئة بشكل كبير. حافظنا على سلالات نجدها الآن. لم يكن لدينا دور في التلوث بشكل كبير. ساهمنا في تدبير المياه، ساهمنا في تطوير المنتوجات وإنتاج كمية من النساء هن في القرى يعني ينتجن الغذاء. فهذه نسبة مهمة، وإن كانت نتيجة للأسف يعني الظروف الممارس فيها القطاع الزراعي هو سيء ويضرب المساواة بين الجنسين في العمق، لكن يجب أن تكون هذه النقطة أيضا نقطة تفاوض من أجل هذه المعارف التي ركمتها النساء والتي دفعت الضريبة ديال عدم التمييز للأسف وعانت من الإقصاء والتهميش إلى غير ذلك. لكن يجب هذه المعارف أن نثمنها وأن تكون نقطة للتفاوض بشأنها، وأيضا حتى الجهات المانحة أن تشتغل على دراسات أخرى بمناطق أخرى من أجل أولا أن نجمع هذه ونوثق هذه المعارف. ولكن أن أعتقد كما جاء في التوصية في الدراسة يجب أن يعترف لنا بهذه المعارف النسائية كما يعترف بحقوق الشعوب الأصلية. يجب أن يعترف بالمعارف النسائية وأن نناضل من أجل أن يعترف بها وأن يتم الحديث عنها في بند يعني واضح في اتفاقية المناخ، وأيضا في الأمم المتحدة أن تعترف بهذه المعارف التي ركمتها النساء عبر التاريخ والتي ساهمت من خلالها في استمرار الموارد الطبيعية كما قلت، وفي تحسين النسل لعدة أجناس من الحيوانات والطيور إلى غير ذلك. وأيضا ساهمت في أن تستمر هذه الموارد الطبيعية إلى حدود الساعة، وضمنت حقوق الأجيال في هذه الموارد. فبالتالي أعتقد بأن فرصتنا كنسويات وكحركات نسائية من أجل أن نتواجد داخل يعني مؤتمرات الأطراف، وأن يكون لدينا موقف موحد من القضايا التي نريد أن نشتغل عليها والرسائل التي نريد أن نوصلها بمؤتمرات الأطراف، وأن نساعد بعضنا البعض من أجل تكثيف حضورنا إلى حين أن يعني يكون هناك اعتمادات لمنظمات أخرى، والضغط أيضا على الأمم المتحدة من أجل تخصيص نسبة مهمة إن لم أقل 50% أو أقول 50% للجمعيات التي تنشط على قضايا النساء للحضور في مؤتمرات الأطراف. وشكرا، وأبقى رهن إشارتكم إذا كان هناك سؤال.
شكرا جدا لك سمية لمشاركتنا عن الإمكانيات المتاحة لنا كنسويات لتحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين، ولتشجيعنا للاطلاع على التغير المناخي وهو تحدي كفرصة لإنشاء تغيير في واقعنا وإدماج النساء في عملية صنع القرار، ولتشجيعنا للانضمام لمؤتمرات الأطراف وكيف التعامل معها وتقسيم حتى المقاعد بين المؤسسات لتقوية وجود النساء في هذه المؤتمرات ولتفعيل قوة المؤسسات النسوية في حضور هذه المؤتمرات، وإعطائنا مقترحات بكيف التفكر بتقوية وجود النساء وإمكاننا لإحداث تغيير إيجابي. شكرا جدا لك سمية. I want to encourage everyone to share with us their questions as well. I can see that we have a couple of questions to our speakers already, and I'm going to raise them up, and I'm going to encourage everyone to share their questions as well along the side with us. We have a question from Mariam, and Mariam started by sharing that we as women's organization would like to work on empowering women in southern Iraq to face climate changes, and but there's a lot of challenges. One of them, the food insecurity, the inability to provide basic living requirements such as food, clothing, primary health services, and that a lot of women are facing grow cases of gender-based violence, and the huge number of underage marriage that is going on at the region. But there is also insufficient support available to address these problems. And her question started by, is it possible to obtain a grant for women's recovery to confront climate change? I want to share these questions with our speakers. What are your thoughts, Valerie? Leanne, because she shared this question directly after your presentation.
Amina, maybe I can come in really quickly. Thank you very much for the question, and this is exactly the kind of support that should be provided. But as I indicated in my presentation, it's actually very challenging to get such funding support through the official channels. The international climate funds, some of them that have been set up under the UNFCCC, usually engage with countries, not directly with community groups. And so it's very often dependent on the structure within countries, on whether some of that money, and that's why I use the expression trickle down, actually reaches the ground, and a lot of it doesn't. So I think, and to be quite honest, I don't know about the particular situation in Iraq, and if Iraq, for example, is a recipient even of climate finance from some of the official funds. I think a much better chance would be to work, and I think the presentation from Valerie was very, very useful in that respect, because it points to the responsibility of those non-governmental institutions that have access, including access to finance, and that's unfortunately a lot of times the international ones, to actually facilitate then some of the passing on financing, or going into collaborative, locally led activities where some of that money can be passed on. That is unfortunately probably not a sufficiently good answer, but that reflects the reality, at least in the climate finance system. I don't know if Valerie has other points to share.
Thank you, Leanne. I think Valerie would share with us her thoughts in a second. She have an important call. Thank you so much for sharing. And until we hear from Valerie, we have one also question for Sumaya. سمية شاركتي معنا عن دراسة في أول تقديمك لأن فالناس عم تسأل إذا بإمكانك تشاركينا الرابط عن هذه الدراسة في الشات. Great. And let's see if we have also another question that we didn't answer before. We had one question for Rania, but I'm not sure that if Rania is still with us, but I would like to open as well this question for you, Leanne, and for Sumaya, and for everyone to share with us their thoughts about it. Educating is very important so people can get the motivation and understand the circumstances and raising their agency so we can act today. But how can we transfer that into action afterwards, especially when it comes to knowing that there's a lot of support when it comes to the grants, but also creating a movement or creating an action to impact positively in your community regarding climate change, and including women in that action is another process. So what are your thoughts about that, especially that we had Rania with us that told us about the importance of including youth by educating them about climate justice and climate change? Please go ahead, Leanne.
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts, and I do recognize that I'm a little bit the odd woman out in the discussion because I work very much on the global level, and a lot of what we are discussing about is building really the movements on the ground. So maybe from my experience on engaging with the international processes, and Sumaya has already pointed out how important it is for the experiences on the ground, for the strengths and the advocacy from the movements to kind of filter up to the international processes, whether that's the COP in Egypt later this year or its international funding mechanisms. Really important is, I think, obviously a better understanding, and their education is really crucial of some of the connections. For example, from my long engagement in you know, the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, one of the things that always struck me there is there's actually not that many feminist organizations that are focusing on finance and macroeconomic issues. And as we heard, since we are really in a systemic crisis and need transformational change that is challenging a number of the underlying both finance and economic structures, this is really an important part of knowledge building. And I'm not saying everybody can do that, but we need to learn to much better tech team so that you know, the experiences of feminists and feminist advocates of different levels, whether it's on the community level or in the international level, are better shared. And again, I think a better understanding economic and financial literacy is so crucially important, I think, right now for all feminist advocacy, doesn't matter at which level, because we need to understand those contexts in order to push back against, to challenge what is often told to us and what is not correct, and to demand the accountability of which so many of the speakers in that panel have talked about. But again, I'm sure that some of the colleagues working more on local context have much better answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can see that Valerie is back. Valerie, would you like to add or to build into what Leanne have already mentioned?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I received the call, so I don't really know what Liana was mentioned. But I just want to express to Mariam, because I've seen her comment in the chat, and I think exactly what you were expressing is also what we hear also from a lot of other organizations, no? And I think the fact that the organizations, they work and they know what are the needs, and they work on the ground, so they have a very good image, a picture of what is needed, whereas the big NGOs, then our image is a lot more adapted to the funding and what we have available. So unfortunately, like the system, it's wrong, you know, like unfortunately, there's no still, and I hope this can change in the future, but still no possibility to say, look, this is money and this is the activities you do as the organization, and we can just give that so an organization can do what they feel it's most needed in their context. And the system now currently works very different. But Mariam, if I would just say, like, for us to try to hopefully have some different ways of working, just at least for Oxfam, to reach out and to express what you feel as an organization, or the need to be in contact with people from the country office or the regional office, and to see what collaboration could look like. And I honestly hope that we can build more positive partnerships in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. I want to thank all of you, Leanne, Valerie, Shireen, Rania, and Sumaya, for sharing your wisdom, experience, knowledge, even challenges and ideas and strategies to face them. Thank you so much for being with us today. Today, we are concluding Kvinna to Kvinna and Oxfam co-organized webinar. It was a pleasure to see this amount of interest and commitment among our speakers and the participants. The linkages between climate change and gender is complex, and understanding this needs more than 6 webinars. However, we hope that you find these webinars helpful and useful in understanding such connections. We will share all of the materials from all of the webinars and the links and the recordings with all of you after the Eid holidays. And if you have any suggestions or feedback regarding the webinars, so please share that with us in the email that I'm going to put in the chat on a second. And I want to thank our participants for attending the whole series and for being part of our discussions and learnings. And I want to wish everyone Eid Mubarak, and thank you so much for everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.